Check, 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 check. Yeah, we're good. I think we're good. You can hear me? Hello, hello. Check, check. Okay. All right, you all. So we are going to go ahead and get started. If I could have everybody's attention, please. Yes, thank you, thank you. All right. So, welcome you all. Bienvenidos. Buenas tardes. Right, buenas noches. Good evening. My name is Marcos Morales. Pronouns he, they. I am the program coordinator of the Hispanic Latinx Indigenous Initiative inside of the Cultural Center. And I'm super excited to be here with each of you all. And so I would first like to start us off with the land acknowledgement, and I invite you all to sit and use this as a moment of reflection, as a moment of arrival here, and sharing space and community with each other. And so with that, in the spirit of supporting and fostering learning through the generation and sharing of knowledge, the Hispanic, Latinx, and Indigenous initiatives would like to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on today is the original homeland of the Shawnee, Cherokee, Osage, Seneca, Iroquois, Miami, Hopewell, and Adena nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected on the land which we gather. Con el espíritu de apoyar y fomentar el aprendizaje a través de la generación y el intercambio de conocimientos, las iniciativas hispanas, latinas y indígenas quisieran reconocer que la tierra en la que estamos unidos hoy es la patria original de la gente Shawnee, Cherokee, Osage, Seneca, Iroquois, Miami, Hopewell y Adena naciones. Reconocemos la dolorosa historia de genocidio y expulsión forzada de este territorio y honramos y respetamos a los diversos pueblos indígenas que aún están conectados a esta tierra. And so, with that, I want to invite here Monica Negron, who is our director.
Hello, everyone. How we doing? All right, we've got a couple of introductions before we get to Dr. Treuer, but again, my name is Monica Negron. I serve as the director for Hispanic, Latinx, and Indigenous initiatives. Big thing that I wanted to do is, one, thank you all streaming online and those who are in the room for coming out tonight. We are so excited. We've been having an awesome day with Anton, and he has been amazing. We had him at 12, we had him at 3, and it's really been great, and we're excited to see what he has for us this evening. So again, this event could not have been made possible without some of our awesome campus and community partners. I'd like to thank College of Arts and Sciences, College of Business, the Commission on Diversity and Racial Equity, the Raymond A. Kent School of Social Work and Family Science, University Libraries, Athletics, Honors, College of Education and Human Development, and then the Filson Historical Society. I know many of you are familiar with a lot of our campus organizations, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the Filson. The Filson Historical Society has collected, preserved, and shared the history and culture of Kentucky and the Ohio Valley since 1884. The Filson is now engaged in a multi-year process of consultation with tribal nations concerning the repatriation of ancestral remains and cultural items held by the Filson, as well as planning for the collaborative reinterpretation of the indigenous history of the lands now called Kentucky. The Filson Historical Society is actually in Louisville, so it's just a couple blocks away. We have some folks from the Filson in here, so Patrick and Kelly, feel free to raise their hand. They're over here. So if the Filson, if you're interested in learning more, I know Patrick and Kelly will be here afterwards, but again, the Filson Historical Society.org. Now, let me bring up Dr. Celine Phillips.
Thank you, Monica. Buju, Wabiganakwikway, Indigenakaj, Mishike Indudum. Hello, my Ojibwe name is Woman Who Likes to Grow Flowers. I am Turtle Clan from the Lac du Flambeau Lake Superior Nation in Wisconsin. I'm Celine Phillips, and I teach in U of L's Communication Department. Among his many talents and accolades, Dr. Anton Treuer is a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University in Bemidji, Minnesota. He is the editor of the only academic journal on Ojibwe-Moan, or the Ojibwe language, with the Oshkabewis Native Journal. He serves on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society and was named Guardian of Culture and Lifeways and recipient of the Pathfinder Award by the Association of Tribal Archives, libraries, and museums. For 30 years, he has worked to revitalize Ojibwe, Moan, and is one of the most prolific scholars in Ojibwe. He's worked with Ojibwe language immersion in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ontario. He's among a team of scholars developing Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe. Year 1 has been completed. He serves on the board of the Washdoka Dating Ojibwe Language Immersion School on the Lakota Indian Reservation, a sister reservation to my Ojibwe Nation in Wisconsin. He's authored 20 books, some of them award-winning. They include Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, The Assassination of Hole in the Day, and Ojibwe in Minnesota. In 2020, he authored The Language Warriors Manifesto, How to Keep Our Languages Alive No Matter the Odds. And in 2021, The Cultural Toolbox, Traditional Ojibwe Living in the Modern World. He's been presented with over 40 awards and fellowships from prestigious organizations, including the American Philosophical Society, the Bush Foundation, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Science Foundation. Dr. Treuer earned a BA from Princeton and a master's and PhD from the University of Minnesota. The UN General Assembly proclaimed 2022 through 2032 the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Dr. Treuer is doing his part to help that cause. His Ojibwe name is Wagosh, which means fox. I think that he's Gayako Bimadizing. He leads a good life. And I think that what is maybe even more important is that he's Anji Bimadizin. He changes life. Thank you so much for being here. Miigwech Anton, welcome.
Miigwech, Kawe Maji Tayan, Niwi Miigwechi Witag was in Enimigwan Bajayan, Minawa Bajayeg, We Wenigo Duiji Kiwendian, Minawa Den Wazu and Geminonisodo Tadian, Wagosh, Indigo Minawa Migazi and Dodem, anyway, Wasawadi Ushkonigan Wanja Bayan, Gazaga Squaji Meka Gajin Akadeg. So good to see you all this evening. Thank you for coming out. English? All right. I told the folks this morning, they asked me to come and speak. They didn't say anything at all about using a foreign language like English. I'm really excited to be here and to address, I think, a topic that is often sitting in the corner of the room, like an angry bear that we pretend isn't there, but we have to navigate all the time. How do we navigate culture wars? How do we build bridges and communities together? This is Tom Stilday. He's one of my elders. He's actually from one reservation over from mine. And he grew up in a village called Panema on the Red Lake Reservation. In that community, no one has ever been baptized. 100% traditional Ojibwe religious belief and funeral practice, among other things that are different from what you might see throughout much of America. When somebody passes away, they bury their dead right in the front yard. And they put a spirit house where people are buried. So if you step out the door to your house, there's mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, generation upon generation, older than America. Whew. Makes it hard to sell a family farm and move to California, which is the American way. We celebrate our freedoms in America so much that they include the freedom to have a malleable identity. If the job's in California, move to California, become Californian. And as a result, people often have a couple of kids. The two kids move to two totally different states. They're using Facebook and FaceTime, trying to keep it real. And it's very different than growing up with cousins who are like siblings because you're so close, and very close-knit communities where there have been generations in the same place. These are fundamental shifts in the fabric of life, really for humans across the globe. But there's a tension, I think, for Indigenous people with this connection to place. Tom was pretty fun. He was the first person who had been named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate who was not from one of the Abrahamic religious traditions. That was him opening up the state senate with his pipe. He had a great sense of humor too. He'd say, "I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it." And that was even before some of the chaos we've seen over more recent years. And we brought him to our university to give a speech, graduation banquet speech, and I'd been working on them for a while. I said, look, indigenous people, sometimes we experience hypervisibility, racial profiling, things like that. Sometimes we experience invisibility, marginalization. Bring him in, you'll have a great relatable experience for our students. And then I had to pull Tom to the side because he was notoriously long-winded. And I said, you got 15 minutes, give him a pep talk, focus on the students, throw in a joke or two, that's it. Okay, he got up there, spoke for an hour and a half. He did it all in our tribal language. He didn't even use any English. We were in mixed company, and I was watching the deans and president glazing over. And then finally he said one thing. He said, all you people who study Indians, study that. And he went and sat down. So I thought he was awesome. But he had some good points. Most of the books written about us were written by non-native people, most of whom hadn't even talked to one of us or spent time in one of our places. That's weird. Really weird. I couldn't imagine being an authority on German history without going to Germany or speaking German, and probably French and English too. But all kinds of people have had careers being experts on indigenous stuff without anything comparable. By the way, it's not just the history books. It's the economic development plan, the suicide prevention plan, the school turnaround plan, all of it. And we're often scratching our heads. How come what I know so well, what the data shows me, isn't working with this population? And that's because these folks aren't in your data set. And because we expect what works for one group is going to work perfectly well for the next. I'll give you a minute or two on me, not because that's the most important thing for you to know, but it'll help frame our conversation. After all, nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we're all different. So there's home right there, epicenter of the universe in northern Minnesota. That's the Leech Lake Reservation. It's one of 7 Ojibwe reservations. There are also 4 Dakota reservations in the state of Minnesota. These are a couple folks in my family tree. Check out this guy with a super ancient face. Believe it or not, he was born in the 1700s and he died in 1922. He was very close to the record for human longevity, although he's not the official record holder. That's also amazing. He was in our area before there was any white settlement at all. 100% of the land was native, but 100% of the people were too. He was still in our area when the soldiers came back from World War I. During his lifetime, native people went from owning all of that to owning 4% of this reservation right here. Minorities on our own reservations. There's a lot of stories to unpack and all kinds of injustices to educate people about. Part of the reason that America claimed ownership of these lands is they said we bought it from France. Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Even though no native person had sold the land to France or the United States. Permission was not obtained. America operated with the view, which comes actually out of Catholic Church doctrine, called the doctrine of discovery, which holds that only Christian nations, preordained by God to rule, have the right to own land. This is how they could send their vassals out to say, we hereby claim ownership of this land and all these people. In the name of the most Christian king, Don Philippe, once, twice, thrice, and by all the times that I can and should without limitation. That indigenous people only had an aboriginal occupancy of the land, but no authority to own anything. There's a lot to unpack there too. It's been a vibrant conversation in some faith communities, as the National Episcopal Church and the National Lutheran Church and some others have formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery. Others have yet to do so. But it's part of an ongoing conversation about reconciliation, owning history, and setting a different frame. And there's plenty more work to do there too. So I encourage you to get educated about it and lean into it. Well, as I thought about this guy, John Smith, or this guy, Wabujig, kind of a famous warrior in our world, I never had tools to talk about this when I was a kid, but as I got older, it started to bother me more that I could go to school for 13 years in a row, kindergarten through grade 12, to learn whatever I needed to be successful in the world, and none of it had anything to do with me. Though my educators were kind, good-hearted people, taking a humble wage to do one of the most important jobs in the world, the message from these kind people was screaming at me through the absent narratives. And the message was, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. Because if we were important, relevant, or mattered, somebody would have said something about it over 13 years of education. Indeed, we have plenty of work to do to improve education in America. By the way, and this is a little beyond the scope for today, but it's important to plant a few seeds and see what happens with them. The majority of the K-12 students in America are students of color. That's who's here. And it kind of doesn't matter, Democrats, Republicans, build a wall, don't build a wall. That's who's here. By the way, something like 65% of the quote-unquote illegal immigrants come by airplane. Build a wall? But that is who's here. And we're going to have to figure out how to get along. If America getting browner is the sinking of the Titanic, we hit the iceberg ages ago. We can rearrange the furniture all we want. But here we are, and 60% of the students of color in America finish high school. It cannot be a recipe for a healthy country if our largest demographic group of students is finishing high school only 60% of the time. We should want everybody to finish, and to finish college, and to be gainfully employed. So everybody's a load-bearing citizen paying taxes. That would be the economic argument, and fully humanized. Native people have made this country and this world as much as anybody else. These are just some of the foods Native people shared with the rest of the world. Corn. What's Kentucky without corn? Potato, a staple in Russian and Irish food. Such a staple that when there was a potato famine in Ireland, it sent 2 million people from Ireland to America. How ironic is that? Tomato. Imagine Italian food pre-tomato. There goes the pizza, the lasagna, the spaghetti sauce, and the Mediterranean diet. Some of my favorites like chocolate and vanilla. The indigenous population of the Americas at the time of Columbus, by the way, we got a couple BCs in the native world, so there's before Columbus, before casino, and before coronavirus. So looking at the before Columbus one, the indigenous population was 100 million people. 100 million. The population of Europe at the same time was 88 million people. There were more humans here than there were over there. Capital city of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, was 3 times larger than the largest city in all of Europe at the time of contact. That city was London. But somehow, we have consistently messaged about scattered bands of roaming nomads in the wilderness, none of whom lived in Kentucky, because it was a vacant land, waiting for everyone else. the reality is, you ever see that movie, Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise sprinting across the Oklahoma prairies and planting the flag and claiming their homestead in the Oklahoma land rushes? All those Oklahoma land rushes happened not just on native land, but inside Indian reservations, to which they had moved many of the people from Kentucky. All of the land was occupied. All of the land was used. In some ways, we message about scattered bands of roaming nomads in the wilderness as a way to say there weren't that many people here. They weren't really using the land, so there was plenty of room for everybody else, and everybody else's coming was not somehow a taking. But there wasn't room, and it was a taking. And it might not be a pleasant truth, but it's a truth nonetheless. These are some pictures of my mom, different chapters of her life. She grew up in that little village of Bena on the Leech Lake Reservation, population 400. Half of them are my cousins. And for her, harvesting wild rice or hunting or fishing was less a cool cultural pastime and more a necessary means of survival. They actually pulled all the kids from school when it was time to hunt or harvest because they had to help with food production. As she went to school, she only met one professional Native person ever. That person was the school nurse. And she thought, well, maybe I can do that. She finished high school, went to nursing school, came back to work for our tribe's health program, and she started to think, you know what? Our people are really getting pushed around, even here on the res. I'm going to do something about that. She went on and got a law degree. She was actually the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. And I would go to court with her. Walking out of there, I would think, she's the only woman in court. She was the only Native in court. And she didn't even explain anything that was going on, but I certainly learned something. What I learned was, we can do stuff. Among the things I can see just from that little bit of my mom's story is the importance of role models. For her. For me. By the way, when I went to school, I never once had an indigenous educator. K-12, high school, college, master's, PhD. And then when I was going for my PhD, I had my first Native educator. By the way, that is the most common experience for Native kids going to school in this country. This is the D in the DEI, and it matters. When people talk about, like, the terminology is like almost taboo because of culture wars, but when people talk about things like quote unquote white privilege, it's not about financial advantage so much as the privilege of being able to go to school and have your race widely represented in who's teaching. If you're white, you get that. If you're not, it's much harder to come by. And the stories about who made America an awesome place. And things like that. Even the very poorest white American will get at least that much. All right. Here's me as a tyke. When my folks were getting started, there were humble beginnings. We had a house with no electricity or running water. We had a hand pump, wash up in the creek in the summer, enamel wash basins in the winter, buy a gallon of milk, tie a string around it, sink it in the creek, kept it cool because it was spring fed, pull it out in the morning, pour it on your Cheerios, away you went. And then, by the time I hit about middle school, my mother had a law degree and built a nice house. There she is with her powwow braids, Indian Health Service, Coke bottle, eyeglasses, suit, and she was usually wearing sorrel boots because it's cold up there. And so, the American dream, I feel like it's half true. And the true part is what I saw my mom do, and also what I saw my dad do, and I'll talk about him in just a second. But also, I'm kind of with George Carlin. You remember the old comedian? cranky comedian. He's pretty fun. Kind of with him when he said we call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. And by that, what I think he really meant was that there are barriers out there and they are not fairly distributed. By race, gender, and a whole bunch of other things. Class. Rich people are going to put their money in a trust fund, make sure it goes to their kids. Wealth self-perpetuates, which means the converse is also true. Poverty self-perpetuates. We inherit economic advantage or disadvantage depending on what happened in our families. That doesn't mean that people can't break out. Look what my mom did. Right? And this is one of the difference among the isms. It is possible to change your economic status. It is not possible to change your color. These are some pictures of my dad. Sometimes it surprises people to know because I'm kind of brown and braids or man bun today, but he was not native at all. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant, a Holocaust survivor. He spoke only German the first 13 years of his life. Got out after the Anschluss, and we had about 300 immediate family members who were killed in the Holocaust. He, 2 cousins, and both of his parents made it out. That was it. He was the only member of the family who ever had grandkids, last of his line. There are lots of stories to share. At age 17, now living in the United States, lied about his age, signed up for the U.S. Army, and I think he wanted to kill Nazis, but they sent him to the Pacific Theater. He's stationed there and fighting the Japanese instead. But eventually made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. I'll share a story. You know, first of all, I want to say that all of the isms, the sexism, the racism, the whatever, it dehumanizes all of us, no matter who might benefit from someone else's oppression. It hurts all of us. And all of us need some healing. I'm actually the first generation in my family that is not served in the armed forces. On my mom's side, everybody, all the way back, my uncles, my grandfather, like every American campaign all the way back to natives fighting natives. Like I'm the first one who's not killing somebody, you know? Which I consider progress. But I watched my uncles and my grandfather win their wars, come back victorious and deeply traumatized. My grandfather committed suicide at age 86 because the VA just switched his meds and it didn't work. I had to clean it up too. It was not a fun job. And so, fighting, whether it's a military war or a culture war, dehumanizes all of us. We need to spend our energy figuring out how to get along and orchestrating that. We got to quit fighting over who gets to be the oppressor and who has to be the oppressed. In fact, that's one of the fears. As our demography changes, we're going to flip roles between who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. And the white folk are going to be oppressed, and it's going to be horrible, so let's stop all of this. And instead, pool our resources and fight oppression. And then, as envisioned and articulated, our founding promise was great. Then it can work for everybody. For most of your lives, there will be no racial majority group in America. We will all experience the need for protection of minority rights because we'll all be minorities one way or another. There's no way to stop that. My father never went back to Austria until 1986. I went with him on his first trip back. That was his first time back after World War II. Man, he was having a tough time. Crying Jags. He had a total meltdown when he stepped out of the airplane and back into the German-speaking world, even though he spoke German with his mom, and it was a language that was in the house. And I think at that time, I was about 17, I mainly just felt angry. I was really angry. And there was no way that I could see to make things right. Sure, the descendants of all the Nazis had to learn about this history, and they probably felt guilty about it. It was mandated in the instruction, and so they had that discomfort. But they all got to have babies and grandbabies and live there. I should have thousands of relatives on my dad's side. You know? There's no way to make up for that. And it wasn't just me or my family. It was all of those millions of families. 12 million people killed in the camps. 50 million deaths in World War II. My God. And so I was mad. I didn't go back again myself until this summer. And we went back, and we went to the Volksschule where my dad went to school, still there. I brought family, my kids. We found my dad's former home, still there. We found my grandpa's former store, still there. We checked out the Karl Marx Hof, which my grandfather and other socialists took over to protest the fascist takeover in Austria leading up to the Anschluss. This happened a few years before. We visited concentration camps. Mauthausen, where my grandfather's mountain climbing partner was killed, among many others. Dachau. We went swimming in Hallstatt Lake, family vacation property. Bunch of brown kids swimming around in the waters there. We went hiking in the mountains. By the way, all of those properties and places, going back here, they were all confiscated, taken from my family, and given away to Aryans who did not pay for them, whose descendants are still living there and enjoying the transmission of intergenerational wealth. So we had some friends there that we met up with. They're an Austrian couple here, Thomas and Mary, and they took us hiking around in the mountains. They're super awesome, kind, generous, let us stay in their house. And they had spent a year in Minnesota and hung out with my dad quite a bit. And they were telling us over dinner one night, they said, everybody in Austria, almost without exception, has at least one grandparent who's a Nazi. For us, the husband and wife, they said, all of our grandparents were Nazis. For him, Thomas, he said, my grandparents were unrepentant Nazis. They saw nothing wrong with what the Nazis did. He did say, I'm glad none of their grandkids think the same way. But we love these guys. Their crazy laugh. And there was something different in my experience coming back the second time. Instead of just being in anger, I was able to see the beauty of this place, the beauty of its people, the beauty of its culture, at the same time that I could see everything they did to my family and so many others. And being able to see both provided me with some healing. That it wasn't simply a gift to all the descendants of the Nazis that I wasn't so bent out of shape and angry. It was convenient, feeling injured, to think bad people, bad country, to be in judgment. But who I was hurting the most was myself. Because it's a lot of work carrying around a lot of anger. And that doesn't mean that would be giving everybody a pat on the back for all these ugly chapters of history, but simply to see things in a different light. It would help me as I would think about my mom and her family. My grandmother taken from her family and sent to residential boarding school and forbidden to speak our tribal language. My mother being pulled by social service workers, put into a car, driven to a foster care placement, and her uncles followed, broke her out of there, and drove her back home. Among the telling details are that nobody ever came back again and she was raised by her parents, which means there was no service of papers, there was no due process of law, there was no court hearing, there was simply baby snatching going on. Because if there was a court order in place, someone would have come back and grabbed that kid. And so, being able also to look at my American neighbors, the white families who'd been living for 3 generations on the reservation, thinking that was a long time. Taking land that had been taken from our family and given to them for free so they could pass it on through generations. And instead of just being angry, to see their beauty and to more fully humanize them without giving a pass to anybody for the ugly chapters in history. This is what America has the hardest time doing. The reality is that yes, there was genocide in the founding of America. There was slavery, chattel slavery, in the founding of America. Even a document like the U.S. Constitution, with a Second Amendment that speaks to the right to bear arms, was as much as anything about enabling slave patrols to police black bodies and enable the institution of slavery, where the separation, like states' rights, was as much about enabling slavery so that you could have some states that believed owning other humans was okay, united in a union with other states that believed it was not. And so we have this mixed bag of oppressions and beauties, a foundational promise that is amazing and beautiful. Sure, we the people meant white male property owners, but it expanded to include most of us in this room without ripping up that Constitution. That's part of its strength. And it's all mixed together in the same place. But all too often, some Americans only want to talk about one narrative or the other. Just our star-spangled awesomeness, greatest nation on earth. And anyone who says anything else or speaks to any of these other things is unpatriotic. But if we want to get to healed, we can't skip the healing. If we want to get to reconciled, we can't skip the reconciling. And healing and reconciling is sometimes messy and rarely comfortable. But going to the gym is rarely comfortable. But if we want to get stronger, we go to the gym and we get wrecked sometimes. And we go back. And if you habituate to it, it starts to feel good sometimes. And above all, you start getting stronger. Embracing a little bit of discomfort is how we get stronger. That doesn't mean beating everybody up for the sins of their ancestors, but we should acknowledge the sins of our ancestors. We should seek genuine justice. We should try to build the bridges and communities to make things different. That means work. And if we don't do it, we just give it to somebody else to do a generation or two from now, if they find the courage. If I hold up my finger and say, what is that? I might start a fight unless we clarify in what language. Because in the language of body parts, indeed, it's a finger. But in the language of numbers, well, that's a 1. And in the language of space, that's up. So, who's right? And of course, they are all right. It's a matter of language, perspective, or context. But all too often, when there's a tough topic like race relations in America or culture wars, somebody's saying this here's a finger, it's not an elbow, it's not a toe. The rest of you, shh. And somebody listening is going, what? It's a 1, not a 2. See? They just don't understand. We totally miss each other. But if we can see that as a 1, a finger, and up, and all the other many things it can mean, depending on the cultural context, that's powerful. That's multiple perspectives. By the way, great advice if you ever want to have a friend, or maybe get married, or work in a workplace with more than 2 people. Because you are not always going to see everything the same way. You could be married to somebody for 50 years in a row, they'll still take you by surprise and give you something to argue about. And instead of shouting them down and telling them how stupid they are and that they don't know anything or I'm walking away from this, I'm sorry, sweetheart, could you help me understand? Very disarming and effective. There's a great book by Desmond Tutu I could recommend, The Book of Forgiving. There are stories in there that are just unbelievable to me. There was a woman who created a peace institute in South Africa with the men who had murdered her daughter. She worked with them every day. I don't know if I could find the grace to do that. But in there, Tutu shares that there's a very simple to say, but critical process for engineering healing. If there's been an injury, and by the way, this template works perfectly for the individual injuries between people, as well as the big collective national ones. Of course, Tutu is famous, won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work with South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation. In any event, he says when there's been an injury, we need to tell the story. As an example, if there's an individual injury, some guy goes out, cheats on his wife. There has to be space made for the telling of the story. He can't say, forget about it, it all happened in the past. That's not going to work. He's probably got to say sorry. Mean it. Be believed. It'll never happen again. Mean it. Be believed. And then there's a chance. But he has to listen to the story of her pain and put a name on it. That was betrayal. Or whatever it was. And then you can do the forgiveness part, which is not saying that what happened is okay, but simply that it happened. And we are going to move into acceptance that this happened, it cannot be changed. And then renew or release the relationship. Either you got yourself a gold star divorce, or I choose to have a new relationship with the same person. This works with the big national ones too. But we're having a hard time even holding space for someone to tell the story. We want to shout them down, shut them up, ban the books, whatever. But it's so critical. This is why sometimes, like, there's a community meeting for building the new football stadium, and you want engagement from all of your various stakeholders. And someone from one of the communities of color shows up, and they want to talk about slavery or Jim Crow or residential boarding schools for Native kids or something. It'll be tempting to say, this seems way off the mark. Aren't we just about building a football stadium? Can't you let it go? Why are you here to beat me up about something that happened in the past? And there's a shout down and a shut up message. The result of which, stakeholders from those groups walk away and you are all alone trying to build that football stadium. But if you can hang in there and hold space, hear and validate that story, they will work with you side by side to build that football stadium. It makes all the difference in the world. It works with everything. My little kid freaking out, bedtime, right? And I'm like, 8 o'clock means little kids go to bed. And I can just go over on her because I'm the dad, right? Shut the door, let her cry it out. What's that going to do? She will get louder because she's got a gift with this. She will cry longer because that's her love language, right? Or I can engage and try to listen. All right, baby, whoa, 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 whoa. What's going on? Him and ha, the beanie boos, the bomb. Okay, whoa, whoa, whoa. I heard beanie boos. If you can lay here, breathe in and out 5 whole times, really slow. I'm going to go look for the beanie boo. I'll be right back. Okay. And she's asleep within 5 minutes. Right? Relationship preserved. Kid getting what she needs. Peace for me. Sometimes taking a few slower steps in the beginning is so much faster to get us from point A to point B. I've seen so many things go sideways. By the way, this is a thing. 2 days ago, they just changed 5 place names that had the word squaw off the National Register. By the way, the word, maybe I should back up and say, word generally considered offensive. Most racially specific gender terms like this tend to be. But it's also complicated by the fact that sexual assault rates in America are 25%. They are 50% for Native women. Most sexual violence in America is white on white, black on black, but crimes of sexual violence directed at Native women are predominantly perpetrated by white men. There isn't a single Native person on the planet who, if not themselves, doesn't have a very close family member for whom being quote unquote treated like a squaw is intensely personal and painful. And the Native communities have said, you gotta drop this stuff. Well, Old Town Baking Company, and by the way, not alone, a lot of companies out west have this product. So my brother was shopping out in California. He said, check this out. I said, what? I said, look at this, put it on Facebook. They're like, woo, and you should have seen my feed. This is before TikTok and all that. And so then I said, look, these guys have their own Facebook page. Conversation moved over there. Right? And then they started to clean their page, taking off the comments they didn't like, leaving the ones they did. So I made a new Facebook page, Old Town Baking Company, Squaw Bread needs a new name. And then a few days later, they were on the local news crying, saying they didn't know it would hurt anybody's feelings, and they were going to have a conversation about the product's name, which they did. And then once things died down, went right back to Squaw Bread. Stuff's crazy. How much easier would it be to just call it wholesome earth bread or something, you know, like whatever. Cultural appropriation, sexual objectification, lots of different issues here. And who knows, they probably used an Italian actress instead. Here's the native who's passed out drunk, the white handle his liquor. Like, hello, we got substance abuse issues and sexual assault issues, and why is this a marketing strategy? But it's getting a little bit harder to get away with things quite the same way. Not just for the sake of human decency, but for a good, sound business plan. Making marketing palatable to everybody is generally going to be more effective. I won't go on too big of a rant on things like mascots, but it's good to be aware of the perspectives. By the way, I think this one is going to be a non-issue. It might just take some more decades. We've already had hundreds of schools and teams that have changed their native mascots and imagery. There's still plenty of hangers-on, and I'm sure you're aware of them. The main defenses of the use of native imagery for sports teams and mascots is simply that, number one, it's just cool. It's like really tough, awesome Trojans, Spartans, and Indians. So we're honoring you. And the other defense is, I met a native who said it didn't bother him at all. Right? And so to those points, I'll just say this. First of all, when you see people at the games doing tomahawk chops and boo, 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 boo kind of stuff, are they honoring someone? Or are they just kind of playing Halloween and joking around? Bear in mind that no matter how much you honor someone, the opposing fans will always defile their opponent's mascot in the name of team spirit. And so you get stuff like this happening at high schools. Hey, Indians, get ready to leave a trail of tears round 2. Hi, Hawaii, hi, Hawaii. Kind of stuff. And there's so many things like this. Oh yeah, we'll get to that one too. And so, so ultimately, when you look at it, I don't know, you guys ever listen to country music? Gretchen Wilson? I'm a redneck woman, I ain't no high-class broad. Just a product of my raising, I say, hey y'all and yee-haw. Does that mean I can call every white woman I meet redneck woman? No. Might that offend somebody? Yes. Can I say to the offended party, you have no right to be offended because Gretchen Wilson is down with that? No. Two tribes have approved use of their tribe's image, the Seminole tribe in Florida for the collegiate sports team, and the Meskwaki in Iowa for the Blackhawks. Over 100 tribes have passed formal resolutions repudiating the use of native imagery for sports teams and mascots. We have to listen to them. The National Congress of American Indians has also passed a similar resolution. And by the way, like, our national sports culture is one of the things that could actually transcend race and unite us. No matter where you land on the debate, you know you're putting controversy in the middle of one of our shared cultural things. And it makes it divisive. And furthermore, for the schools, somewhere in the mission statement, it says something about education and maybe even inclusive learning environment. So if you're getting this happening at high schools, you are doing something inimical to the mission. Let it go. And a lot of people have, but not everybody. We're seeing this stuff happen now with Confederate flags, statues, public space, and it invokes some really interesting questions. ultimately, the questions revolve around freedom of speech, a public good, and inclusive public spaces, another important critical public good. And I do think we have to be careful with how we advocate and what we are advocating for. There are both Democrats and Republicans who are saying and doing some troubling things. You heard my view on mascots. I did not say we should ban something by federal mandate. I did say we should change them. There's a difference. I think it is important that the KKK and the neo-Nazis get to walk down any street in America, have a rally, say what they want to say. Because if we get in the business of banning anybody, we can ban everybody. That is different from saying we should take our tax-paying dollars and allocate those dollars to support organizations that sponsor hate. Saying we will not use tax dollars to support a hate group is not a suppression of their freedom of speech, which they are free to speak on their own time and their own dime. But when we have public institutions, be they political institutions, public educational institutions, public squares, it is okay to make decisions about what we should center in our public spaces with our financially, publicly supported monies. So, to that end, I think giving primacy of place to heroes that everyone can get behind might be wise. I totally understand that 100 years from now, my great-grandkids are going to look back and say, man, my dad picked some whack heroes. Take them down, put something else up. I'll be like, yes, that's democracy. They should listen to them, not to me. And there have been many of these happening, and boy, it makes people uncomfortable. It's emboldened into city and state flags. I'm on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society, and there were a number of pieces of artwork that were not even as much of a trigger point as some of those, and boy, you should have seen the fights over them. Like this one, which is just historically inaccurate. This is like Father Hennepin discovering St. Anthony Falls. How can you discover a place where a bunch of people lived? And, you know, the native people were taking him there. He wasn't like, you know, the beacon upon which all of the people revolved. You've got the bare-breasted Dakota woman in the background. I remember there was a reporter saying, why should we take that down? You know, that's censorship. But they had fuzzy bubbles over the woman's boobs. I was like, wait a minute. You don't want the art down, but you don't want to show it on your newscast because boobs. You know what I mean? Like, just really not thinking it through. And so, you know, also these things were right behind the podium where the governor would make announcements with the signing of bills and things like that. I said, look, in a museum you can provide context. I want my kids to learn about Christopher Columbus. That doesn't mean I want them to learn to worship him, right? I want my kids to learn about all of these controversial figures in history. I want them to learn about Hitler. That doesn't mean I want them to worship him, right? And so it's okay to revisit what we want for focal points. And ultimately, giving primacy of place to things that can genuinely unite us would be very, very wise. And it would not suppress anybody's freedom of speech. And so here's on primacy of place. How am I doing on time? 10, all right. So I'm going to give you a tool or two that might be helpful navigating. This is a picture of my wife and I back in the day. Man, we experience this world so differently. We live in rural northern Minnesota, and we both like to go for a run. Now, when I get up in the morning, go for a run, I'm like, the birds are singing, the sun is shining, this is awesome. And I don't really feel unsafe. There are people texting and driving, but I'm on the other side of the road. I can get out of the way. Once in a great while, someone will slow down and give me a mean look, and I'm like, I'm an Aubrey, God, But for the most part, I'm like having a great time. Now, when my wife goes for a run, she has a different experience. If somebody slows down to give her a good long look, or pulls over to the side of the road to deal with your cell phone like you're supposed to, her heart starts to race. She's like, oh my God, this is it. This is going to be a sexual assault. What's my escape plan? Do I run in the woods? Should I go back now? Why did I go for a run? I could have just gone on the treadmill. The data says she is not as safe as me doing the same thing as me. My many conversations with her reveal she never feels as safe as me doing the same thing as me. And guess what? I happen to be a nice guy. I work at a university for many years now, and I have chaired many search committees where we are looking for new employees, and I have consistently on every single one made sure at least half the people on every committee were women. I'm trying to do the things, but whether I like it or not, I'm safer in that context. By the way, it's not enough to stop her from going for a run. It just diminishes, it blunts a little bit of the joy from it, not enough to stop doing it, and it diminishes her safety, not enough to stop her from doing it. And by the way, she has not yet been sexually assaulted on a run, but it's just a fear hanging there in the air, right? And here is what makes it tough to talk about this. And the issue is actually that as Americans, and this is true for everybody in the Western world, we are enculturated in the same space, and we are enculturated to individualism. What is my last name? Put that on the kids. What are my accomplishments, my degrees? I mean, nice job with reading the resume. Right? Me, my. And so much so that we are so competitive about it. How many sporting events where nobody wins and nobody loses? Yoga? We'll probably have the yoga competition soon. How many board games where nobody wins and nobody loses? And there are a couple, like Sinking Islands, everybody gets off or nobody does, cooperative. But for the most part, I am crushing the kids at risk. I am whooping someone's butt at chess. We're very competitive and very materialistic. By the way, these things can serve positive purposes. Having a competition can actually hone your abilities, entrepreneurial spirit, drive, ambition. It can be positive. But we are so steeped in those things that when we say there is a problem with sexism and patriarchy, men start to think, wait a minute, I'm a good guy, you don't know me. And the reason is, because of this individualism filter, people often receive it as an assault on their very character. We are talking about systems, policies, procedures, and patterns. Women aren't as safe when they go for a run. But what is being heard is, you just said I'm a bad person. Judgment of my individual character. So the problem begins with our definitions of the ism and how it works. And it's humans, and humans are complex. So yes, sometimes people have, at the micro level, individual acts of sexism and patriarchy. But then there are all these patterns, policies, and procedures, and then at this kind of macro level, there's a smog that we're all breathing. By the way, just because someone, for example, is a woman does not mean that they are not well conditioned to things like patriarchy and sexism. My wife and I go out to eat all the time. 85% of the time, they give me the bill. 15% of the time, goes in the middle of the table. They do not give her the bill. And it might not seem like a privilege to always get the bill, but it comes with the assumption about, we have these weird sexist sayings like, who wears the pants in the family? Who do you need to please or impress if you want a tip? And most of the servers, when we go out to eat, are women. Now, when we get into cars, roles reverse. My wife can be cruising 43 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, driving kids to school, which, by the way, in all honesty, is pretty normal for her. And the cop on the corner is like, lady, keep it down, and just points. She's never been pulled over, never had a citation. Right? I'm a fuddy-duddy professor dude. I'm usually wearing my nerd glasses when I'm driving. And I am not exaggerating when I say I've been pulled over about 40 times. 40. Twice this past year for no seatbelt while wearing a seatbelt in broad daylight. Officer, I am wearing a seatbelt. Oh, you are now. Within policing, one of the issues is discretion. If we did stop and frisk in the college dorms, the newspaper headlines would be all about the epidemic of white collegiate drug abuse because there's a dime bag in half y'all's rooms. But that's not where we apply the discretion. You don't have to admit. But twice I've had cops pull guns, including in a routine traffic stop in a minivan with a "My kid is a middle school honor student" bumper sticker with the kids in the car in the broad daylight, to the window, unholstered. Woo. We have a big blended family. First time I took Blair camping, we had a pile of kids in the car, get pulled over, and the cop's like, license and registration, is giving me a shakedown. How do you spell your last name? Who owns this car? I'm like, is it hard to believe that I own a late model Honda? You know, get out. And I'm thinking, man, I know I have a constitutional protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. And if I say that, he's really going to get upset. So fine, sure, get out. He starts going through camping gear. He says, you wait right here. Goes back up. Ma'am, are you okay? Are you sure you're okay? Yeah, I'm fine. And I don't know if it's because there's a thing in patriarchy that treats women as property and it looked like I stole the white dude's property or what. But it was weird. Finally gets done going through everything. We're sitting there about 45 minutes, hands me back my license and registration, says, you have a nice day. Because again, I broke no laws. I got in the car, I was like, Blair, are you sure you want to be with me? Because this is not the last time that's going to happen. She stayed. But even all of our kids have been pulled over. And it's always a risk. By the way, it's not enough to stop me from going for a drive. But it does tax the enjoyment of the experience and my safety. By the way, if we talk about racism, because of the individualism filter, people start thinking if there's racism, there has to be a racist. If they're not looking at themselves, they must be looking at me. Wait a minute, I'm a good person, you don't know me. But we're not saying you as a person have malicious racial intent. We're saying there's a pattern. People of color don't get to live as long. And we want to do something about that. By the way, I'm good friends with a chief of police in our hometown. He believes in community policing. He comes to our courageous conversations about race. He even put our tribal language on the cop cars. Gunawainja gang, Minawa Nadama gang, to protect and serve. How cool is that? This team still pulled me over 40 times. Right? Not bad people. Patterns, policies, and practices. So we have to look for those things. And it's not an assault on anybody's character to to look for those things, because we all deserve to be safer and we all deserve to live long lives. As a brief example, this was a Navajo kid in the foster care system and going to school in Texas, and there was a rule that said all boys need a haircut above the collar. Foster parents said, we don't have permanent placement yet. This is an important part of their culture. In his tribe, if someone cuts their hair, they only do that when there's been a death in the family. He was just removed from his parents. He might think his parents died. This could traumatize him. It could even be considered assault, but it's compulsory that he attend school. So what do you want us to do? Well, if you can prove that he's an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe and authenticate that this is an important part of their religion, we can use that to petition the school board for a variance, which they did. But I raise this to say, there probably wasn't someone in Texas saying, how can we be mean to Native kids? Bad individual. They're probably thinking short hair is normal for boys. They're probably thinking we had problems with bullying before, and if everybody has short hair, there's one less thing to bully each other over. This will make their lives easier and better. So a lot of times, policies, patterns, procedures are not made with any kind of malicious intent. We just don't see. We don't know. My wife doesn't get like a telegram when she's driving the kids to school that says, you were just not racially profiled today. Have a great one. Right? It just feels normal. Just like when I go for a run and come back and I'm like, that was awesome. It just feels normal. I don't realize, unless I really apply myself to thinking about it, that was actually a gender privileged experience. You may have seen some iteration of this picture at some point in your journey. If not, you surely will see it again. But here, standing on the boxes, that is me going for a run. Down in the pit, that's my wife going for a run. Or flipping rolls, there's my wife going for a drive. Here's me going for a drive. The context shifts. We're so fair-minded, we give everybody the same supports, but that doesn't mean everyone can see, play, or be equally compensated for the same efforts. If we give people different kinds of supports, it's a very imperfect solution. That's like affirmative action or something. Drives people crazy. And it doesn't change the fact that we still have to do something to address these horrible inequities. So what would it look like to kick that fence down altogether? And that's where you get a justice frame. Important to acknowledge, this stuff does freak some people out. These are pictures from 100 years ago, when the women's suffrage movement was coming to fruition. And men were terrified. Oh my God, if women get the vote, they will completely disempower men because there are more women than America, or more women than men in America. And if they enter the workforce, they're going to take our jobs and men will be financially eviscerated. Well, with 100 years of hindsight, we can see how ridiculous this is. Women did get the vote, women did enter the workforce. Guess what happened? Right? For starters, women got the right to vote, and today, 17% of the world's democratically elected leaders are women. Patriarchy is alive and well. Men were not disempowered in that process. Furthermore, when women entered the workforce, the stock market took off, roaring 20s. Even though men were the primary owners of stocks and the primary beneficiaries of women entering the workforce. Fears unfounded. Today, though, the fear is if people of color rise, they'll be taking jobs from white folk and political power from white folk. So let's make it harder for them to vote or whatever. Make it illegal for someone to hand someone a glass of water when they're waiting in line for 4 hours in a row. You know? Make no mistake. I am coming for everything my ancestors were denied. But that should not scare anybody. Because by that, I mean I'm coming for longevity. And if I get it, it will not reduce anybody else's longevity. I'm coming for dignity. And if I get it, it will not reduce anyone else's dignity. It will enhance everyone else's dignity. I'm coming for prosperity too, and that will not reduce anyone else's prosperity. If we all have jobs, we're all load-bearing citizens paying taxes. Coming for equal rights. And that will not reduce anybody else's rights. We all do better when we all do better. Even when your neighbor's house value goes up, yours does too. I like the Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Who would those thoughtful, committed citizens be? And I'm looking at them. I'm going to switch through this one quickly. I like the Lila Watson quote too. We all need healing. Colonization, taking one language, culture, religion, and using it to supplant all the others, and using violence to achieve that end. That dehumanizes all of us. Yes, it's worse to be the victim of that, but it dehumanizes us all. Also, solving your problems with violence makes a bunch of other problems. Why would we think all the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems can be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? It can't. We have to find something different. And like it or not, we are all in this together. So if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time, but if you've come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together. And with that, I want to say thank you for your kind time and attention. Miigwech. Don't run away just yet. They're giving away some books.
Also, before this entire section just leaves, we are about to put a survey up very shortly. So everyone, please hold, take our survey. We do have time for a couple of questions too, and then we'll also see who wins the survey. So again, as Marcos gets this up, everyone take our survey, please, and we will, as this is happening, take 2 minutes, take the survey, and then we'll do the books.
Question? Okay, we'll run the mic to you.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I have a question, and this is regarding on my indigenous heritage and friends. And they has told me why we have to use Indian word. I don't like to be called like that. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so the questions about terminology, Indian, Native, Native American, Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nation person, or what? We have an unsettled debate going on about terminology. And just like we've gone round and around in many other communities, Black, African Americans, certainly not colored people, but people of color to be a more inclusive label, and it's still somewhat unsettled. Similarly, in the Latinx community, you know, Hispanic, but that excludes the, you know, folks from Brazil who are Portuguese speakers, you know, Latino, Latina are gendered terms. Latinx could be inclusive, but if you're trans and you want to be seen as O or then it's different. And so we've got debates going on, and with us too, same thing. Obviously, Chris Columbus was lost, thought he was in China. No. Japan? No. India? Yes. And Indians? Boom, and it stuck, you know. So it's a misnomer. And some people, because of that and because of where it came from, really don't care for it very much. But I'd love to see us do what they did in Canada, where they had a national conversation. There they said we're not going to call the places reserves, we'll call them First Nations, and we'll call the people from there First Nations people. Speaks to indigeneity, sovereignty, just a couple of syllables, everybody knows who you're talking about. I'd love to see us do something like that. All of the words have some shortcoming. I would say this, Native, Native American, and Indigenous tend to be politically correct. No one's going to get offended at those, but they can be a little ambiguous, because when you say Indigenous, could mean Maori from New Zealand. You have to say North American Indigenous, and it ends up being more syllables, which is fine. Same thing with Native. If you say a Kentucky Native, is that Native American from Kentucky? That's a lot of syllables, or just someone born and bred. So you have to establish context. But once you do, I think those are fine. Some folks have doubled down on Indian or American Indian, because those terms are written even into legal statutes and things like that. But I think all of that's surmountable. You will find organizations like the American Indian Movement and National Congress of American Indians that have held on to those. Probably as much as anything, because changing the acronyms will get everybody all confused, like honestly. And but there's still Native American Rights Fund and others. So I can't say there's been a definitive agreement. You'll find different answers from different folks. I do usually recommend, like when I'm working with a school district or something, to say, hey, assemble your Indigenous advisory group or your Native parent committee and ask them what they want you to do, which will have you being responsive to your stakeholders, having a good process and conversation with them. And then if anyone gives you grief, you can say, we take terminology seriously here. We have an annual conversation on this. I'll make sure your comments get to that conversation, and it gets you a get out of getting beat up around the ears card. So I would recommend that for a process to begin with. For myself, you may have noticed, I kind of use them all somewhat interchangeably, aware of their shortcomings as a means of establishing safe space. But I certainly have a terminology discussion with any organization that I'm working with. Any other questions? You guys ready to raffle off some books? Okay, so we'll do that, and then on the table outside I've got some business cards. So on there on the website I've got lists of Indigenous authored books, resources for teachers, YouTube channel with lots of shorts on all kinds of other questions and things. So by all means, check those out and feel free to keep in touch. You've been awesome. Thank you.
All right. So we're gonna have Dr. Treuer here do this for us. So let's see. We got about 5 books. So let's see.
All right. 080. Lucky winner.
No? Okay. We're going to go again.
Next one. All right. How about 088?
I knew it. I told you had a winner. Okay.
We got a winner right here.
All right. Here we go. Next one.
081. 081.
Nobody. Okay.
They're on the run. Yeah, right. Here we go. 090.
Boom. Monica, the next one's over here. Okay.
102.